with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, as I mentioned, our economic and political levers with Egypt are quite considerable. With respect to Iraq, it is important, I hope, that we will keep a residual military presence there to keep Iran from gaining more influence. The satirists are pressuring Prime Minister Maliki to not extend in any way our presence, with some 47,000 troops still there, and I hope that the Prime Minister can be persuaded that it is important that the U.S. continue to maintain a military presence in Iraq as a way of reducing Iranian influence. With respect to Afghanistan, it is also important that we continue to maintain a strong military presence. The surge obviously has ups and downs, but it has weakened the Taliban, and a negotiated settlement will be a much better one from our perspective if we can continue to put pressure on the Taliban and their allies in every way. With respect to Iran, as everyone on this panel has been stating, it is important to strengthen the democratic opposition. It is Iran which is the terrorist state. That's where the terrorism emanates, and that's where the focus should be. The State Department is going through their process as the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia required them to do, and I hope that as they do so, they will expedite their decision and that they will reflect on the fact that the UK and the EU, to which I was an ambassador, have both lifted their restrictions with respect to the MEK, but the State Department, I hope, will make their decision based on the merits and to do so quickly and promptly, again recognizing the precedents that others have created. It is important that we strengthen democratic forces not only in Iran but throughout the region. This is a critical inflection point in the history of this region. And it is incredibly important that we put every resource, including the G20 pledge of $20 billion, into Egypt and Tunisia, and to support the democratic forces there to make it clear that going in a more radical direction would be a subterfuge of the whole Arab Spring. What happens over the next 6 months will have meaning for decades to come, and we have to act with great alacrity. One last point. I've lived with sanctions and helped craft them during the Clinton administration. I called myself the sanctions meister during that 8-year period. There is no question that the 4 rounds of UN sanctions, together with the EU and U.S. unilateral sanctions focused specifically on the financial sector in Iran, are having an effect. They're raising the cost of the nuclear program. That, together with cyber warfare, defections, and assassinations of key scientists, have slowed but not stopped the program. There is a real economic cost. Western consumer companies are even withdrawing, even though they're not directly involved in sanctions. There's less investment in their energy area. It's very hard to insure a ship going into Iran. China is a problem, a real problem in the sanctions effort, but the sanctions are working. But it is not clear that with this regime, sanctions will be enough. It is unacceptable for this regime to have either nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons capability. Therefore, when we talk about every option being on the table, we need to mean that every option is on the table. Thank you very much.
All of your activities here demonstrate how much the American people care about Iran. It's one of the biggest foreign policy challenges that we face, and this morning you'll hear a range of views of how we ought to approach it. But every single one of them is going to underscore the need for democratic change and respect for human rights in Iran, which is a goal that I know all of you share. And if you watch the sweeping changes across the Arab world, when a fruit vendor's self-immolation in Tunisia sets off a wave of protest, anything can happen overnight. The people of Libya are still suffering under Muammar Gaddafi. The regimes of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen continue to resist the march of history. And Iran remains locked in a time warp as well. And the failures of the regime in Tehran to live by the rules of the international community, its continued repression of democracy and the human rights of its people, stand as a real challenge, not just to those of you in this room, but to U.S. policies as well. Decades of our policies, sometimes isolations, other times outstretched hands, have simply failed to bring about fundamental change in this aging regime. Now, the United States faces not only the challenge of democracy and human rights in Iran, but also three other key challenges. First, Iran continues to support terrorist organizations that threaten our interests, including Hezbollah, Hamas, some of the Shia armed groups in Iraq. Second, it continues to seek a nuclear weapons. And third, Iran continues to undermine our efforts both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And largely of this agenda, the nuclear policy drives U.S. policy and much of the international community. And it's the nuclear agenda that has driven many of the failed efforts at engagement across both Democratic and Republican U.S. administrations. Iran's controversial nuclear and international efforts to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons to Iran is what dominates the broad international discussion on Iran. The recent IAEA report highlights both the concerns about Iran's weaponization activities and its technical difficulties. And earlier this month, there was a report on a panel of UN experts that declared that the multilateral sanctions adopted under UN Security Council resolution last year, strongly supported by the Obama administration, is having a significant impact on Iran's ability to proceed with its nuclear program. In other words, pressure works on this regime. It's clear that Iran is decision-making is guided by a clear cost-benefit analysis, and the more pressure we put on Iran, the more you're going to get results. And while we're pushing the Iranian agenda, I think the U.S. needs to stay focused on what we're all here today to talk about, which is the increasing repression in the Iranian regime. And Iran's repressive behavior, its nuclear program, its support for terrorism, undermining our interest in these regions are all directly related to the lack of democracy at home. They go hand in hand. And until that changes, until there is democratic change in Iran, the United States and our allies around the world will continue to face multiple threats from this regime. It will not change without a hand-in-hand democratic change. And a year and a half ago, before that young man set himself on fire in Tunisia, sparking that wave of protests, Iran's own protests surrounding the 2009 elections demonstrated the hopes and dreams of millions of Iranians and really captivated the world's attention. But as well as we all have seen, unlike in Tunisia and Egypt, the opposite happened in Iran, and the brutality is continuing against the protesters. You have friends and families and relatives who have been subject to not only imprisonment but execution as well. The government severely limits citizens' right to peacefully change their government through free and fair elections. It continues a campaign of post-election violence and intimidation. The government committed extrajudicial killings, executed persons, including juveniles, through unfair trials, sometimes group executions. Security forces under the government's control committed acts of politically motivated violence and repression, including torture beatings, and rape. The government administered severe officially sanctioned punishments, including amputations and flogging. The list goes on. There are, at the end of last year, over 500 democracy activists and journalists in detention, in prison, and my guess is that number is on the low side. And some of you have experienced the brutality of this, not just during this 2009 election, but in years past.